And welcome back. Now, South Africa's two largest telecom service providers, MTN and Vodacom, have filed papers in the Gauteng High Court in Pretoria against the Independent Communications Authority of South Africa, Icasa. Now, the telecoms companies are following suit after Telkom filed papers of its own against Icasa last week. The case has been prompted by Icasa's decision to withdraw the temporary radio frequency spectrum by the end of November. And Icasa issued the spectrum in 2020 as a temporary measure after the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic in South Africa to enable the sector to meet increased demand for ICT services and also to ease network congestion during the national state of disaster. Now, last week, Icasa said that they will challenge the case. And joining us now is Dominic Cull, who is an electronic communications law expert and owner of Ellipsis Regulatory Solutions. And Dominic, good morning. The name of your company? I don't know if I got that correct.
Good morning. You were great. It's just Ellipsis.
Perfect. Thanks so much for speaking to us. Now, Dominic, let's just start at the beginning with this one. Let's start by explaining radio frequency spectrum and how it's actually allocated.
Okay, so radio frequency spectrum, it's pretty much the most critical ingredient for companies like Vodacom and MTN and Telkom Mobile when they are trying to provide you with a mobile service. So one where you can have a conversation or watch a video on your mobile phone or your tablet and you can walk all over the place and the signal doesn't drop. Icasa, the Independent Communications Authority of South Africa, they are the independent government agency which is responsible for giving out the spectrum. But let's be clear, the spectrum belongs to all of us. It's a commons. It's belonged to all South Africans. And companies like Vodacom, MTN, Telkom Mobile are given the use of that spectrum by government, by Icasa, in order to provide us with services.
So if we look at what's happening at the moment, and we know, of course, Dominic, that for a while now, there have been calls for the spectrum allocation to actually be rolled out. But where we find ourselves at the moment with Icasa's decision with the temporary spectrum allocation, it was temporary. So looking at the decision right now, and is this at the discretion of Icasa to actually withdraw it now? Is there anything untoward with that?
I don't think there's anything untoward. And let's firstly say, well done to government and Icasa for back in 2020 actually giving the opportunity to the mobile networks and others to utilize the spectrum on a temporary basis, because it really, really, really made a difference to all of our experience during lockdown. You know, even if you were just watching Netflix and keeping yourself entertained, or if you really needed to work using that connection or learn as a scholar or a student using that connection, it's been a really good thing. But you put your finger on it when you say it's temporary, and it always has been temporary. And yes, Icasa does have rights to take that spectrum back. And, you know, the mobile networks and Telkom are saying, you may have that right, but you haven't actually exercised it correctly. You haven't got the timing right. We still have all these challenges. We still need this emergency spectrum. And if you take it away now, it's really going to have a terrible effect, not just on our profits, but on South African consumers under COVID.
So if we look at that particular point in terms of how consumers will actually be negatively or adversely affected by the withdrawal of this temporary license spectrum, how will they be impacted? So from where we are right now, end of November, how are things likely to change?
Okay, so this is a little bit speculative, but I think for a lot of people, what you would experience is not that you suddenly won't have a signal, or you won't have connectivity or access, but that you'll be competing for a smaller resource with a lot of people, so your quality of service is not going to be so great. So we might be trying to have this Zoom interview, but because there are so many people sharing my mobile connection at the moment, there's going to be jitter and I'm going to sound like that. So the main effect will be a quality of service one, if the mobiles cannot manage that. And let's be clear, if the spectrum is taken away, then they will do their utmost best to manage the negative effects and look at other ways. Sakina, I think it's worth saying here that everyone's very well aware that the most important people in this piece of the puzzle are the consumers, are businesses which are reliant on electronic communications and reliant to an extent on this additional capacity. I think that we can point a finger at the regulator and say you're taking this away too early. We can point a finger potentially at the mobile networks and say, well, you always knew this was temporary, but you've used it to launch new services and to act as if you had it forever, which you knew you didn't. But what is happening now is that we seem to have far too many lawyers running the show and far too much of an inclination to run off to court. And we've had massive delays over a year now to getting the spectrum into the market. It looks like we may have more delays now because we're running back to court. And what is really needed is someone to show very strong leadership here. There are practical compromises which can be made. There are interim measures which can be put in place to make sure that Icasa is happy, the mobile networks are happy, and consumers are not negatively affected. And we need to, as consumers now, look to Icasa, look to the Minister of Communications and Digital Technologies, and even to the President who is interested in this issue, and call for real leadership so that we don't end up making lawyers richer and our own communications experience poorer.
So what are some of those real solutions at this point, Dominic? Because as you can imagine, there are arguments on both sides, and even from smaller players in the industry who are saying it is the big boys who are running off to court. And as you say, perhaps not an ideal situation where people choose to litigate all the time.
It's far from ideal. So one of the smaller operators, Rain, which offers an uncapped mobile data service. They've been very vociferous about this temporary thing being to their disadvantage, that it's anti-competitive. So one shouldn't get the impression that the telecoms industry is all ganging up together on and against Icasa. There are quite a few people who are on Icasa's side, like Rain, who support Icasa in withdrawing the spectrum and don't necessarily see all these negative effects. The minister has raised the possibility of interim assignments of spectrum. We know that we're hopefully going to hold an auction to have permanent assignments in March next year. So we're moving towards slowly, but hopefully now finally moving towards this position where the temporary spectrum won't be important because we've gone through a long-standing process to actually give permanent spectrum to the mobile networks, to Telkom Mobile and others. So this issue will no longer be important. So it's almost like we need to bridge a gap between now, October 2021, and the end of March 2022 when this auction takes place. So we're talking about a 6-month period. There are certainly mechanisms for interim assignments and things which can be done, which are just practical. They don't make the lawyers richer. They just protect our experience over the next 6 months.
And of course, come March, that spectrum auction, which has, of course, been in the pipeline for some time as well. How does this open up the industry really, Dominic? Because is this going to be another opportunity for those who have greater financial and other muscle resource-wise to just basically expand? Or will this offer a real opportunity to bring more players in and in so doing maybe make the space more competitive to the advantage of consumers?
Great question. I'm afraid mostly this will be a process for those that already have. So if we look at who responded last year to the invitation to apply for spectrum, it's Vodacom, it's MTN, it's Telkom, it's Cell C, it's Liquid Telecom, and it's Rain. So there are no new names in this process. But certainly what Icasa is hoping to do is to say, right, well, we'll give the spectrum to a Vodacom or an MTN. At the same time, we're going to impose obligations on them to create greater competition below them. So more mobile virtual network operators, more resellers being active and competing with each other on the service layer. In terms of really getting new people in, the government has put a lot of faith in a policy around something called the Wireless Open Access Network, the WOAN. So there's a licensing process for this entity, which will also be given spectrum. It will be given the appropriate licensing. And it's really a lot of hope has been invested in this WOAN as the vehicle for introducing competition to Vodacom, MTN, and Telkom. We also experiencing delays with the licensing of the WOAN, and they're likely to be more. So, we'll have to wait and see what happens there. But for the immediate future, this is in fact all about Vodacom, MTN, Telkom Mobile, to a lesser extent, Rain, Cell C, and Liquid Telecom.
And what will this mean in terms of changing the landscape, not only as far as Wi-Fi and other cellular service provision goes, but in terms of broadcasting, for example, the sort of things that they may be able to do? If you look at something like Apple TV as an example, what would this offer?
Well, that's putting that spectrum into the mix just makes it easier for the mobile networks and others to offer us better services. And we broadcasting, it's a difficult term at the moment because, well, those of us who are old enough grew up with broadcasting, which was linear. You turned on the television, you watched whatever was on, adverts and all. Whereas I think young people today don't even really understand that concept of broadcasting. Now it's IPTV and it's video on demand and it's Showmax and it's Netflix. And all of this has been recognized by government, which is reviewing the policy. We're going to in future talk more about audio visual and audio services rather than broadcasting, because these things come to us in a variety of different ways. Now, companies like ETV, and there are others, have been very active in the space around the spectrum. They talk about 5G broadcasting services. They talk about enhanced bidirectional broadcasting services. It's difficult to predict what's going to happen in that space. And the blurring between the telecoms guys and the broadcasting guys, well, that's going to continue to happen. But look out in say the next 3 to 5 years, once broadcasting digital migration is complete, for new kinds of experiences in broadcasting, and definitely more interactivity between you and, for example, which camera you may be watching a soccer game through.
And then, of course, the issue of our developmental imperatives as a country. And some would argue that the opening up of the spectrum is actually meant to assist South Africa in that regard, in basically achieving our developmental imperatives. But if we look at the scenario that you just sketched for us of who the players will be next year during that bid window in March, what about the monopolies that exist? And what is it going to take to actually break those, would you say, Dominic?
Okay, there's some who would take great exception to describing them as monopolies or duopolies or oligopolies, but, for example, if you looked at some of the prepaid pricing per gig for the mobile networks at the moment, you'll find they're all the same. So there's huge similarity in the pricing between what you can get from Cell C all the way through to Vodacom. So one does start to ask questions. And certainly it's the role and of the Competition Commission to ask those questions. And so you're talking about, well, how do we deal with these monopolies and duopolies? And it's really primarily the role of the Commission to have a look. And they're having a good, hard look at telecoms. Since 2002, they've been dealing with complaints around Telkom and unfair competition. They are busy with the data services market inquiry. So also looking at the cost to communicate. How do we deal with that? And for them, part of the problem is this concentration of ownership in the industry. But it's one thing then to deal with those big players. You're also trying to translate that into having a lot of smaller players and empowerment. And then what you were talking about, which is the most critical thing of all, which is dealing with this digital divide, the digital haves and the digital have-nots. And I think as a country, we've made massive strides, and particularly the mobile networks have given us a huge leg up in terms of the number of people who have access to services. And we now really need to work on the affordability of those services and the quality of those services. Will the spectrum help? Well, yes, to a degree it will, in the same way as this temporary spectrum has helped us to get over the hump of COVID and lockdowns and the so-called new normal. But at the same time, it's not going to happen if we leave it up to Vodacom, MTN, and Telkom. We need our Competition Commission, we need our Independent Communications Authority to be strong, to recognize that if we don't actually make sure there isn't anti-competitive effect, if we don't introduce new people into the markets, if we don't look at community networks and things of that nature, we're going to be sitting with the same problems in 5 and 10 years.
Dominic, appreciate your time. Thank you so much for breaking that down for us and helping us understand what's at stake here. And that, of course, was the electronic communications law expert and owner of Ellipsis Regulatory Solutions, Dominic Cull, sharing his expertise on the regulation in relation to the Icasa case against the country's largest telecoms companies. And the case was, of course, prompted by Icasa's decision to withdraw the temporary spectrum that was issued last year to meet COVID-19 conditions.